Thank you all for coming. Particularly, we want to thank Eric, Jeff, and especially Thom Mayne.
Hey, wait. Why
Well, because he's the only one that is not local, so both of you are obligated. Thom was not.
What are you talking about?
He's the only one who volunteered to come.
he wanted to sit there. What's the problem?
No, I couldn't see.
The slides are here.
I know.
That's all right.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll leave it on that one.
I thought the images are just going randomly.
They are.
What I heard. They
are.
don't even know who put the image up, but the idea.
Okay, so let me just tell you very quick what the thing is about. As you know, Jeff is one of our distinguished professors, so part of the thing that he's been doing in the fall and spring, in the fall, he's been working with the undergrad thesis run by John and Devin, and also he's doing a series of master lectures. This is one of those, and the topic is architecture and politics. And that being said, I think I'll pass the ball to Jeff.
Okay. Well caught. How about that? I imagine this to be the beginning of a conversation that I'm hoping that we can keep going on an interim basis, and then maybe with some more momentum in the spring, about the questions of what's the relationship between politics and architecture. And just as a couple of jumping off points, I wanted to remind you of what I thought were really incredible remarks by Thom Mayne at the graduation. Maybe the best close, in the brief period of time that those remarks are, I think he said the most stuff that I've heard in a long time. I really went away moved. Maybe he'll reiterate it more exactly, but basically, having looked at the two biographies in the New Yorker of a scientist who was trained and raised with a kind of courage, and the biography of Michelle Bachmann, who was trained and raised in a kind of fear and needing stability, he saw in that the kind of dialectic of the conversation in architecture today, in which fear and stability and fear of change and fear of experimentation had sublimated itself into a kind of professionalism, I would say, and unwillingness to take chances and unwillingness to understand the value of chances. And so I thought that was a really great point, and I wanted to remind everybody of that. Two other things. The question of politics and architecture has a really long history, and it's multifaceted. I want to touch a little bit on several of the facets today. Perhaps the one most, intellectually interesting is the one raised by many philosophers and many art critics, and that is that architecture can do nothing, despite all of its efforts and all of its interests, but serve instantiated power because of its large demands on scarce resources, because of the amount of money it takes to build, because of the political environments in which they're built. It can't do anything to help mobilize or enfranchise or ennoble anything but the people that pay for it and use it. This was the arguments of everything from Bataille to the film V is for Vendetta, to Robert Hewes, who Robert Hewes in The Shock of the News knew was arguing how wonderful art had become and the ability to explore the existential individual, and how despite architecture's ability to state the public power had not found a mode for speaking to that. And that tends to be the argument we discuss the most. But I just want to point out a couple other cases. During the feminist period, which I think most of you aren't old enough to remember, which is such a weird thing to say, now that all women have all rights and get everything equal and don't have to be argued for anymore. People like Diane Girardeau were at USC, is where she? GSD, was a strident feminist and was basically arguing against all sorts of speculative and theoretical models of architecture, simply to point out how little architecture was occupied by women, and how little it paid attention to anybody else but the subject matter itself and in its internal discussions. And she and I don't speak to each other, we don't like each other, but I've always respected the fact that she did that work. And so much so now that architecture schools that I see and I teach in have changed from almost entirely male with an occasional female student to not only being populated at roughly, they appear to be equal levels, but also being taught by so I think that's a kind of fait accompli. We've made some grounds of that. I'm not really sure we're very good at understanding how we think about difference as well in our work as we would like to think. And you guys, particularly the undergraduates here, are really going to face a world that I keep trying to describe. It's already different. When I was born, the population of Earth was 4 billion. I was 30 before it hit 5 billion. I'm 60. It just hit 7 billion. By the time you're practicing, it'll be at 9 billion, which is the holding power of the Earth. And if you know anything about holding powers, when populations get near the place of holding powers, they don't level off. They go like this. They use too much, they use too little. So it becomes a really dramatic demand on scarce resources. There's the fatally wounded world economy. There's the issues of ecology and losing resources. I mean, you're facing a completely different world. There's a new book out that I saw that Lucas Freireis, have you seen the book? Really, it's called Testify, really wonderful book publication by NAI. You'll get your chance, thank you. Just got off the plane, so I have to kind of unwind. Which shows a whole group of architects all over the world who are combining their disciplinary interest and disciplinary discussion with various forms of advocacy, agency, and action. Going out to build schools, but building schools with some sense of responsibility, not just for scarce resources or inexpensive stuff. I'm probably looking at something really terrible. It's going to be a long conversation. I'm hoping we're going to touch on all these things over the course of the year. I wanted to start with the two people that I thought that I knew in this environment that were closest to being like you when they were your age. Basically, they didn't know how to behave then. They were arrogant about their talents with no basis whatsoever for justifying that arrogance. They knew something was wrong with how they were being taught. They knew something was wrong with something that they thought they understood better than anybody else, which is the world of architecture and its possibilities. And they fought through a kind of vague ignorance by finding conversations with fellow friends, particularly with each other, I think. And now I think they're dominating figures in the world of architecture today. And so I think I'm going to ask them basically to touch on three things. What is their model of how architecture affects the lives of people in ways that are less obvious than anybody else might say, which is what your speech was about. And because it's one thing to discuss fear and confidence, but it's another thing to say, if you're confident, what can you do with it? Okay, and then I'd also like to hear something about your experiences in actually engaging the political world, the reality of the political world, your clients and the the legal and economic environments that you work in now all over the world. So I'm going to start off by asking each of you to reflect a little bit on how you think actually architecture in general and your architecture in particular strives to do a kind of work for the largest sense of a political notion.
Well, I guess you would have to start it with some a basis of the relationship of architecture and urban design in the 20th century. We should start with CIM, Team 10, et cetera. And if you just did a very schematicized kind of conversation of that dialogue, it'd be the Athens Charter, and it'd be the distribution of dwelling, work, recreation, and infrastructure. And then it quickly shifted, and it was a highly Hilbert-Heimer-esque mechanized notion of architecture, which was then attacked by the end of the last sessions of the CIM and with Bachema and Aldo van Eyck. And of course, van Eyck was arguing for the satisfaction of man's emotional needs, and Bachema was paralleling that with notions of the spiritual, et cetera. And there was a deep connection of architecture and the main thinkers. And of course, and then we could rattle off the existential and the Sartres and the Jean Ponty, et cetera, they were all influencing this dialogue. And then of course there was this complete collapse, my generation, as I came out of school in the 70s, that whole world had collapsed, and it was the beginning, unbeknownst to us, a shift to capital to the private sector in this country, and out of that, again, I'm just condensing this insanely briefly. I'm interested in the realignment of architecture and broader urban issues, and I think the terms have changed so radically that you would say that this first argument was essentially humanist, wrapped up in ethics, morality, et cetera. And I would have said today, I have no claim in terms of ethics or morality, although I have to say I overemphasize empathy in terms of the connecting tissue of the human character, and I'm probably overly optimistic in terms of the importance of the empathetic sense of us that connects us to other people. But I see the shift is gone from moral, ethical, humanist to much more realpolitik, and it's a biological conversation which talks about your discussion or the beginning of the increase of population, et cetera, which is just going to be a requirement. And out of that comes a need for, it seems like we're in a time where it's an ideal place to look at the more advanced operational processes available to us to understand complex, integrative problems. And they operate within economic, cultural, social terms. And the discussion is to build up arguments or to challenge the questions, the way we even approach the nature of the city, et cetera. But finally, it's still connected to some attempt to join architecture and planning, to realign those. And it seems to be essential that we do that.
Can you be specific, either in some project of your, not without choice lies, I mean, where is a project or a moment where you thought the standard received wisdom of how to handle this?
So in the book I just put out, the Combinatory Urbanism,
Yeah.
the project for 2012 for the Olympic Village, which we won, of course, didn't happen because New York didn't get it. By the time we did that competition, I'd been now working on the LA Now stuff at UCLA for maybe 5 years, and the office had shifted based on our GSA work from design work that was seen. Our major emphasis was still in the most traditional notion of the broad design of a building into something that was more strategic and required a tactic. And that happened with me with the GSA building in San Francisco, which we would never be able to produce that building without making alignments to values. In this case, it had to do with urban public space, workplace, and sustainability. And we approached it that way, and it was an absolute shift in the way we thought about projects, and the aesthetics followed. The work was a result of that, and it was never conversation. Well, by the time we got to 2012, we were interested in much broader, integrative kind of ideas of what problems were. And we took a housing problem and we made it into a public, a broad cultural problem. And the output of that project was producing 3/4 of the site, which was a 45-acre park, which had been the fourth largest park in New York. Well, when that was presented, and I was working with Dan Doctoroff directly in that project, and I remember the second presentation asking him whether anybody else was on this tack, because it was Zaha and I forgot 2 other people, and he said no, and I came back to my office and said, okay, we've got it, we're in a good place, we found a position here, and it's dealing with large macro issues, and again, I could rattle off now, I could keep going, but I'm going to stay with the notion of the park. And well, when we won the competition, and Doctoroff is leaning over and just talked to me and is giving Bloomberg his talking points. It had nothing to do with housing. It was a housing project for the Olympics, and it came with a huge complexity of program. It was the legacy. It was going to leave New York, a 45-acre park, which is the 3rd largest park, and it was strategic. And that's exactly what Bloomberg said. That this project is going to be the legacy bubble, and it's that type of, and then the work, which it seems that there's been a continual criticism, which I think is somewhat valid, the aestheticizing of the work, like even the book, which is, I guess, kind of pretty. And I found it, if you make things beautiful, it's not good, because you're staying, I'm staying with that aesthetic model, let's say. And, but finally, it's the integration between a method of seeing, a method of observing, questioning, that comes from an architectural position, which is much more intuitive and makes different types of leaps and operates off of radically different synaptic kind of stuff, and the logic of large-scale, integrative,
Okay.
radically political economic work.
I want to turn the question over to someone who's never been accused of making anything beautiful. But but I would like to hold
Getting a little soft.
I would like to hold the idea that the intricacy and the scale of complexity produces something that integrates various ways of thinking, but Thom's claim, said in passing in sotto voce, is the aesthetics follows. His argument is that somehow or another, if you solve the problems correctly, you understand the intricate problems enough, it will produce its own aesthetics. And that's an argument I want to debate with you in a moment after. Go.
Just to set the premise slightly differently, I think this originated, or the suggestion that we would include the political in a discussion at SCI-Arc came out of a level of, I think, exasperation. That's probably the right word. And I think talking to Kipnis, but maybe it was Hernan, and looking at the Republican candidates for president, and I think maybe it was Kipnis saying, where the hell is Bush now that we need him? In other words, the question, I said, how, or in other terms, how low can you go? And it surprised me, and it had gotten so ugly and so debased and so pathetic. On top of everything else, it's very difficult to find somebody who can tell an empirically accurate story, which is to say, I got it right, but you got this right, and so on. So the discussion was polarized in such an extreme way, and I thought that avoiding that subject matter at SCI-Arc was probably a mistake, so that we decided to include it in the discussion that Jeff has some responsibility for, allegedly. I was coming at this very differently, actually, and it really has nothing to do with some capacity to deliver a contemporary analysis of history and who's doing what and who's up and who's down and what forces account for what behavior, and how when you were 30 and somebody was 70 and somebody was 15 and all of that. I'm not sure it goes like that at all. I'm not sure we're the same as them, and I'm not sure they're the same as we are, and I'm not sure the distinctions have anything to do with generational characteristics, although conventionally that's the way art and architecture are discussed, at least currently, often. I don't know that has much to do with it. I think if you tried to start at the beginning and you said life is personal, and you're trying to figure out if something is political, what does that mean? And if it's political, it suggests there's something collective or something which is shared. When I stuck up that Durer woodcut of the Four Horsemen, which could be talked about in a lot of different ways, but it's a way of looking at the world as if the world is directional or teleological. It goes to a certain place with certain forces. It gives you a way, it may be formulaic, depending who's interpreting what, but it gives you a structure of how things are. And what's interesting about it, it comes from Revelation, the last chapter of the Christian Bible, which is talked about in a lot of different ways. And what interested me about it is that there's a meaning underneath the meaning. And it seems to me if you accept it, I'm not saying we should accept it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just using it as a for instance of something which in a broader sense could be Freud, could be Jung, could be Bartok, a lot of different ways. You try to, Thom mentioned the Athens Charter, that you try to get a hold of the world and not so much say, this is what's coming, but this is how it ought to be. This is how it ought to be, and let's work on what ought to be, and we'll say that's what it is, or that's what it will be. So it gives a kind of structure. And an interesting example of this, it's in here somewhere. There's a Cocteau drawing of Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring. Right, there it is. And it's not clear. I think many of you may know the story, and I can't tell you the truth, but the truth probably doesn't matter, because if it didn't happen, it should have happened. So whether he made it up or whether it happened or not. So, but apparently the first performance.
I know the
this is
truth.
Diaghilev. You were there.
I know the truth.
But the truth doesn't matter. Is the point.
It does when you know it.
Huh? and maybe not. A lot of people knew the truth and said the opposite.
Yes.
History loaded with that. So why should we be an exception? And Diaghilev was the producer, the Russian guy, I think. And during this performance, this is the first performance of the Rite of Spring in Paris in 1913, and if the story is so, there were fights in the audience and riots, and he misused the bassoon, or he didn't misuse the bassoon, or whatever he did.
Pretty good.
Atonal dissonance, all of this kind of thing. And I think what Stravinsky is an example of, which is to me back to the Gnostic discussion, is that life is personal, and in a certain sense the obligation is always to turn it over, because whatever it is, for a moment it always coalesces, it always becomes a method or a system or a teaching or a learning, and it solidifies. And what I was always interested in and tried to find, which is another way of saying why is the work so often so clumsy or so crude or trying to feel its way, because I'm trying to find its way, I think it's more intellectual than it used to be, but it's still there. To find a way to sustain something which you can't sustain, which is this kind of fragile quality. And I think that may exist outside of politics altogether. So there's an argument there is no politics at all.
Well, I have to say, first of all, you two now don't need me. You have now set the terms and conditions of an incredibly interesting debate, and that is this question of the personal, which I used to call your argument about the adequacy of the self, and Tom's basic argument that we live in a different world, we have more robust tools, we can solve problems in a much more effective manner without applying threadbare tropes.
All true.
And let me just try to link these together, if I could briefly, with my normal brilliance, as I pause to try to think of something. If you guys knew the Rite of Spring better and the episode better, then we could do the entire discussion on that. But if you'll just allow me a little bit, the story he tells is pretty good. The Stravinsky writes a piece of music, it's polyphonic, it's polyrhythmic. Nijinsky choreographs it, uses incredibly ugly costumes. I forgot who did the costumes. Did Cocteau do the costume? I can't remember. So there were 3 artists involved, and the audience, one of the people on stage had a black tooth to represent no tooth. And apparently a dentist starts the whole thing by yelling up, can't you even have good teeth? And so really the music had barely started, and it really wasn't a riot with fighting. It was hissing back and forth and yelling constantly between audiences for and against it, so that you could never hear the music. But since then, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is the piece of music I teach as the single most important cultural event of the 20th century, I think, because it put eroticism, personalism, I mean, I think it's astonishing precisely because it discovered in the personal a latent communitarianism that had already manifested itself and was looking for some way to be made public in a particular medium. In other words, you can't be personal as if personal is just you. You can only be personal in terms of the conditions under which your capacity to be personal is constructed in a material and in an environment of forces and matter. So this idea that you can somehow be personal in isolation from politics as opposed to personal in your expression of politics is one of the key questions for architecture, because every other art form takes advantage of that, becomes political by being personal. So we think of abstract expressionism as highly political in its existential ambitions because it was so personal. But somehow architecture, for reasons that could be just the history of its weight and just how much it costs to build and how heavy stuff costs. You know, I mean, if you don't really have frame structure, you can't really be thinking about section. So it could be that, or it could be the fact that architecture somehow must serve at least some imagined model of a collective constituency, and therefore has to forego, to some extent, the deep personal explorations of a creative thinker that later on produce a completely new politics or a new existential condition. So,
But as soon as that happens, it's over.
yes,
Don't get hurt.
I'm
So
not.
that-
No, but you have insurance, right?
That's the argument.
Yes, that's right.
In other words, there's an impetus for something.
Yes. Once
And
we
there's
have
an
manifested,
initiative- There's an initiative, and as soon as it has allegiances, and as soon as it has followers, and as soon as it has a
That's right.
constituency, according to this hypothesis, go somewhere else.
that's right.
Yeah, I am the completely other side of the fence. I think the personal, having to do with this particular conversation, the political aspirations of architecture is more or less irrelevant. And I sensed that when I started my firm, Morphosis. And I already sensed that it was a critique on the dominance or the authority or the singularity of the author of the work, which I didn't believe when I was 19. I already sensed that it was a collective work, and that the work was much more interested in discovery and was probably closer at the time, connected my education to a scientific community which saw the world in terms of indeterminate, unknowable mysteries, etc., which propelled you. And one didn't have to have the manifesto was already dead in the water, absurd. The notion of vision is absolutely ridiculous. One doesn't even understand the nature of the metropolis today, much less have a vision towards it, right? A preposterous idea that we have no ability to really understand it within complex, organic, intricate terms. And it's going to be the struggle of the next couple of decades if we're going to survive in economic, biological, et cetera, terms. And that the precise interest in architecture and urban design allow you to shift your own sensibilities. Working at small scale or working with an architectural format, you can I think the idea of personal is also a more complicated issue, that you can use those, quote, personal aspects in a different way, which are more, which don't require a constituency, which operate within one's private world, and that you can operate that when working within broad, politicized urban problems, they're constituencies, and it's a negotiated work. And if you're looking for some personal, if you're looking at it within personal formal terms, it's a hopeless endeavor. You're in the wrong profession. This is a series of agreements, and in today's world, it'd be a whole discussion. In this country, of course, we're suffering from a huge problematic, even the definition of public, because we're in an era of doubt, and we're in a time where there's a huge difference between, or a separation or a discrepancy between values, which include the notion of the public and any kind of a singularity that comes out of a democratic enterprise, right? Which is one of the arguments today. And so as working within city planning, you already have a daunting task in terms of finding any kind of constituency, because it's so basic, the argument, that you've got a group of people that don't even agree that there should be any kind of a single authority, or that don't share an ideal of a collective as an idea. And it's under attack right now, and it seems absurd in a way to many of us, but it's actually a very serious conversation, enough to split the country half and half.
See, I wouldn't.
And the notion of personal, everything is personal at some level. Of course it is. A political act, to have a personal dimension, it doesn't mean the expression of that in literal terms, because it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your own value system and the alignment or misalignment of your own position to something vis-a-vis the problem as seen by X amount of publics.
I don't know, I've never looked at architecture as a profession. You pick this because you're like this, or you're good at this, or I mean, it has a very different meaning, and it includes, I think, ultimately, if it's practiced in the way that it should be, a vantage point which originates in a private way of understanding what's possible. Science is no different in a way. So to juxtapose science and architecture, I think is a colossal mistake. It's a misunderstanding. Now, if you're talking about contemporary science, where somebody says, okay, all you guys go to Alamogordo, and you're gonna figure out, we know how to split the atom, we're gonna figure out how to make a bomb. It's a team. It's, in Tom's term, an agreement. Everybody agrees. They could have agreed to make a battleship or a hospital or a light bulb or anything else. At that point, it's less science than it is the application of something, which is not the art of discovery, but the application to purposes which in fact have very little to do with science at all, in a discovery sense or an inventive sense. So I think what you want to do is split the insight or the discovery, which is very often personal, but needn't be personal or private in the sense that it excludes other people. But it's not a collective effort. I think as soon as it has to be an agreement, it requires a different set of conditions that allows it to go forward. Now, that wouldn't mean you couldn't make something in a smaller way and implement it in a more collective way with a series of agreements which might be politics. The problem is if you confuse the first step with the second step.
But this is going to have a lot of different bits to it. Part of the discussion would be if there's even an interest or a belief that architecture, you began your statement, whether architecture is the capacity to in some way change society, to shape behavior, to in some way influence our lives in political, cultural, economic, whatever terms, humanistic terms. And the discussion would start, I think, yes, no, does or doesn't.
Okay, do you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There's no question.
Your turn.
It's unequivocal.
I don't think so.
I think it's unequivocal too, although not in one word that you said. I am completely, absolutely convinced of it and believe I can prove it, but not in any of the terms you've stated. You know, in fact,
Let's keep going.
every term you state is exactly why we keep making a mistake and not doing it the way we should be doing it. But go ahead. Do you believe it? I'm curious about it. That's a great question, I think.
Do I believe what?
That architecture, to some extent, maybe we overestimate it, but to some extent, architecture can help transform life.
It's an odd job to assign yourself, you know? I mean, I think if yeah, it is.
I'm a teacher.
It is well, wait a minute, but you're something else before you became a teacher.
That's true, but I believe...
You know? I mean, if you're Jesus or something, then maybe you've got other capacity that's been assigned for you. But I think before you can fix things for somebody else, I think you probably have some obligation to understand something about what it is you're fixing.
Okay, let's ask
and how you're part of that, or how you're separate from it, or how to engage it, or how to separate yourself from it as opposed to starting out by saying, let's transform it for the different, for the better, for the worse. Does it get different? Does it get different?
Let's go a different direction. Since I would have said that the three of us and a huge amount of people in this audience would completely share an understanding that we're interested in the conceptual direction of architecture, and we've invested a sizable amount of our lives to that problem, to that idea, and that we're completely comfortable with architecture as an autonomous act. And you've seen the recent, I'm still doing that. And part of my life, I go by myself and I operate privately,
Yes.
right? And we agree on that. So that after that there's an agreement that that world, that the autonomy has to do with very different investigations of all of us. Then what's left? What's the next conversation? After that, is it at the service of anything? If it isn't for somehow therapeutic, no way. I'm way too, the notion of a broad modern agenda. Of course not. I'm a 67-year-old architect.
Okay, but let me.
I know good and well
do you
what
want to answer?
architecture can and can't do.
I mean, what you just said, I think, is exactly right. That is, we agree, not in a general abstract sense, not necessarily on specific terms and conditions, on the autonomy of architecture as a cultural practice and its value in itself, just that. There's a value to that. And I would say a political value to that. You then say, what after that? You now are in an environment where you are schooled and comfortable in that, and you now have to respond to a whole lot of other problems and a whole other set of opportunities. What can you bring to that over and above the other, is what you're saying. See, and then when you start to talk about the over and above, is when you talk about the public space, like for example, when you're talking about the GSA building in San Francisco, and you start to name the attributes that you achieved by suspending your interest in the aesthetics, and then as you achieve those, the absolute issues of architecture emerge on their own right, that's when I would get very uncomfortable, because everything you would have listed as an achievement at the GSA, I can guarantee you Bob Stern would have listed also had he done the building. It would have been LEED's gold plus have public space plus be as much as it possibly can. And and you can't explain the shards, the finger shards that come through there as having anything else other than to change your expectation of the weight of authority of the public zone in a courthouse building. Whereas if you walk in a courthouse building and there's a centralized chandelier and caryatids and all that sorts of stuff, you are being told to be submissive to the weight of that authority. So virtually every gesture you make is about relaxing that at a level of psychology, social psychology, I would say, not science. Comes from your study of architecture as an absolute cultural.
That's a great point, because that's exactly where the personal enters the project, and that
I'm quitting.
this is where we discuss resistance.
Yes.
And what you're looking at is some sort of a delta between the a priori notion of what a courthouse is or isn't, or any of these public buildings,
Right.
and your resistance to that authority. And the product is in some way your success, maybe, or it's an index.
Well, this is an interesting question about whether you could actually do that. And then this is just a hypothetical question. By ipso facto, if you make it and you're claiming to make it and simultaneously undermine it, in other words, the difference between one architect who is more conventional, whatever you said, caryatids and chandeliers, and an image of something of dissonance, of atonality, the sort of Stravinsky quotient. And the question is, does one undo the other? Meaning, does one make in this case, a court, we're talking about a court, I guess, does it make the process suspect? Does it make the procedure and legal procedures, does it call those into question, meaning they should be other than what they are, and we should start over again? And I don't know about that. It's because architecture can't, in a fundamental way, do anything in a certain sense, and I think you started out by saying this, but confirm in the act of doing what in another way it has an instinct to undermine. And I think this is a kind of schizophrenia. What I would say is the personal aspect of this understood, which is a kind of continuing struggle and an internal debate. It's not like I'm a certain age and now I know it. It's not like I'm a certain age and now I get it and I know what to do next. I mean, I'd like to be able to say that, and there are people who can say that. I can't say that. I can see the contradiction in some of these arguments, and I don't feel like I have to make the argument whole or coherent. I mean, I might have to do it publicly, and I'm prepared to lie about that and to misrepresent about that, and I've done that, and I suppose I'm in the process of doing it again. But I think at least there has to be something. If you're going to lie publicly, you have to tell the truth privately. And I consider this discussion a private discussion.
But they're not private. You could be, the courthouse is a
In this
good example.
room.
And that the dialogue was absolutely straightforward between two radically different political views in terms of my client, who's the Chief Justice, one of 50.
You're talking about the one in Oregon.
And I just happened to be there this weekend, and talking with him, in this particular case, it was somewhat successful at one level, and then I completely changed this guy. Because he went from an absolute rigid interpretationist, we had a year conversation about that, and we ended up in the building which had to do with an openness and an idea which would have to be understood through its representation in terms of an idea of the basis of an understanding of our governance, starting with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it came out of dialogue, and it came out of a discourse, and it absolutely finally is this collective act. It's not mine, it's not his, it came out of this discourse of actually 15, 20, 30 people, and it's the nature of public architecture. I asked, what is the other choice? How can it be other? What's the possibility?
Well, I give you an
It's not your idea,
example.
my idea.
We
That's not going
spent,
to happen.
well, maybe.
Nobody cares.
Well, I'm not saying anybody cares. That's why I said this is a private discussion. A public discussion is a different discussion. Private in the sense this is in front of a group of students.
It's a disciplinary
Private
discussion.
in that sense.
But I think
Not
you're also
public
being a
in
little
that sense.
disingenuous.
We sat in Russia for almost 3 years working with Putin, Kasyanov, Shmuzafarov, Gref, all of that stuff, and did it once, did it twice, and finally couldn't do it. Couldn't make all of those issues, as Nakasawa said to me, you have to win the politics, you can't just win the architecture. And working with somebody like Vladimir Putin over a subject matter which is actually the capacity of Valery Gergiev and the Kirov Ballet, which actually has nothing to do with the aesthetic talents of Putin or Moss, actually. It had to do with making it possible for Valery and his characters to do very remarkable stuff. And I think people were tripping over what was a very different series of agendas. And in the end, the whole thing collapsed. And maybe that was me. I mean, I'm sure I had a role in the thing, and whether it could have come out differently. So this is a subject for a lot of discussions. But for me, at a certain point, it wasn't possible anymore, even though the opportunity was probably, to work for the Kirov Ballet is to work for magicians,
right?
And nothing better than that. And it's the people that are doing it. I mean, it's very funny to represent a court as if a chief justice is the court. But of course, that's not the court. The court is a group of people in a room, defendant, plaintiff, judge, next court, next court, next court, in a collective sense, with a social and political mission over a long period of time. That guy just happened to own the thing at that moment, and it either worked or it didn't.
He's different. That guy happens to be capable of defining this moment in history, what a court is or isn't.
That court.
Not to be discounted.
What that court
Huge,
is.
huge amount of power.
Yeah, but for example, the difference
And
between
you
his
sit
court,
with them And they sit down and talk together privately
I know,
twice a
but-
year.
the difference between his court and the San Francisco court right across the street from the GSA building is it's the most radical court in the federal system, and the Oregon court is one of the most conservative. The judge you were talking about. So, and, you know, this is what
Well, does it do that? In other words,
When
does
you're
it
in a-
expedite, I mean, you look at what we did for the Miriinsky. And the Miriinsky supported it, and the guy who ran it supported it, but he couldn't make it work.
couldn't make it work in terms of collecting the
Couldn't
forces
get
that would,
Putin
to say yes.
Sign the check.
Okay. And your sense of that was why? Putin was not going to associate himself with a level of speculation in the architecture, or he didn't see, I mean, what was your sense of it?
I think in the end, I wasn't able to sit in a room with these guys and show them that what we were doing was absolutely in their interest and in the interest of the furtherance of the content of the subject matter that was on the table in front of us. And this was the way to do it.
Yeah, see, I'm starting,
Touching on a really whole other territory, which just about everybody in this room is going to be interested in. There's been an enormous realignment in terms of the class structure in the last decade.
yeah.
And there's been a shift in global realignment economically and politically, which has huge, huge effect on architecture. And more anybody in this generation and this gang will find our way through this thing, but it affects everybody. And working in China, working in Indonesia, working in the Middle East, and you start discussing the specifics of that, and they're radically, radically different concepts, which ask questions of, which really challenges you to really, that one has to become somewhat self-selective and ask very serious questions in terms of the nature of this work and the nature of the client you're working for, and whether there is in fact the capability of some alignment having to do with the value structure.
But let me,
See, one more thing. I think
Yeah.
there's a very different subject.
many more things.
And it's in some ways more mundane and more pertinent and more current. The four projects I put up that I showed here the other day, one is the Goddard Tunnel, one is moving the Yellow River, one is the Han and the Nakdong and the connection in South Korea, and another is a proposal to reconstitute the entire Mississippi Delta. And in fact, those kinds of projects, one of which is done, one of which is being done, are, I think, suggestive of the direction contemporary work is going in terms of a possibility. The capacity to deliver it in a technical way is now there. It probably wasn't there before. And what that kind of project requires is a kind of quintessential political hand, because there are a whole series of participants, parties, interests that have to coalesce in order to make those things plausible. So it's really the other side of the equation. In other words, to operate on that scale, you have to be able to bring together very different vantage points, and it's a completely different discussion, actually. It's not a design discussion in terms of what does it look like. It's an operational, tactical, strategic, social, and political discussion. If you make a river through South Korea that connects Japan through South Korea to China, I mean, you've made a city, a recreational, entertainment, you've connected pieces of the world in a very different way.
And the easy military.
That subject, actually, in the piece that I was showing, came out of the Asian Wall Street Journal, and it was in the program of a guy, actually a Harvard Law School guy who became the prime minister, and that was his program running for president. That's what he wanted to do. So what might long ago have been a Team 10 discussion among a few people, or even an Athens Charter discussion, or a futurist discussion, or was now a public political discussion. I think that's a significant change, and it's a conceivable outcome, actually. It's not a fantasy.
Well, I'm going to pick up a theme of Hernan's, actually, and change it just a little bit, and show the relationship between Hernan and Danielle Libeskind. If you talk to Danielle, I don't know if you read this thing, I can't remember, it was in World Architecture, I think. It was an analysis of the most successful speculative design firms. And Danielle's is the most successful. He has the highest rate of getting a job after he meets the client. He has extremely happy workers. And the counterexample was Rem Koolhaas, who is the most admired for his sociological, political, and intellectual thought, and has a very unsuccessful record in comparison to Danny. And so I was asking Danny, Danny, when you listened to Danny's presentation at 9/11, if you knew the project and you knew the thought that went into the project, he never said a word about that. Not one single word that would have been the disciplinary discourse was ever made public. And in fact, he rewrote the entire project to make it cloyingly available to a public, the whole 1776 tower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the architects fell victim to that as well. But he's very good at telling two kinds of truth. The kinds of truth that you tell to a client who are going to let anything happen as long as certain needs and expectations are met, in order that another kind of truth that you're discussing with your colleagues in this absolute discussion, with the conviction, and it's strictly a matter of faith, with the conviction that your ambitions, your existential psychological ambitions that drive that are not a matter of self-serving monument building, but actually do make a contribution to the world. And I think that comes pretty close to how you two guys operate. That you're out, you've become an expert at discussing the problems they need to understand, solving those problems, but in the end, the solution to those problems is going to be sufficiently generic and plastic that anything you would like to do, or not anything, but it will enable you. For example, we've talked about over and over again, the more complex your architecture becomes in terms of the demands that are made on it, the better it is for you because you're interested in showing an intricate, irreconcilable, unresolvable set of relationships. So the more complicated, it doesn't really matter if you're in China, San Francisco, and China's perfect for you because it's so complicated, you couldn't even list the number of complications. And so it's a marriage, I think, of opportunity between what you want to achieve for an audience and what your responsibilities are to a constituency, which I think is actually it's the model that I would like to stay closest to. It also doesn't really require you ever to say, if I put the door here and it's this big, it'll set this number of people free, or it'll make this number of people feel, if you see the Queen of Holland riding from her home, which is an apartment house, to her, on a bicycle, and then you go just an hour and a half away, and you see the Queen Elizabeth, or whatever her name is, Queen of Elizabeth. You get the difference. You know that there is going to be a difference, and the difference is going to be palpable, and it's going to affect a lot of people. But mostly, it's going to work at the level of an audience. Like most people don't care about architecture at the level of people care. Like the people that were in the audience of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, they had already announced that they care. The rest of Paris could care less. And pretty much, I would guess that's pretty close to a building the kind that we're interested in. There's going to be an audience of people who think, man, that is really doing something for me, to me, and that's actually who you're speaking to, I think. The opportunism of the other stuff, I think, is absolutely necessary to teach. I think your claim that your interest in those complexities should be the interest in complexities is probably difficult. I mean, it's a little bit like saying rock and roll now and forever. And that just never happens. And that's where the generational thing comes in. It's not so much that I don't really think that one generation feels like they need to do something different from another, is that they've become inured as an audience, not as someone who uses the instrument for its utilitarian values, but as a member of an audience, they become inured to the effect. And it's not that they need something new. They have internalized the existential movement of that work, and they're bigger for it, but they're not as big as they could get. And I think that seems like a really good and simple model for understanding the debate.
Just talk about the alignment of a strategy or of a design methodology with a problem, and there's going to be cases when they're more aligned.
It would be, look, you could put every one of your,
complex problems in terms of methodology.
but you could easily, your buildings could look full of rectitude. All they need is more 90-degree angles and less, oblique grids. I mean, so you go out of your way to.
But see, this is actually very unfair in a way, and you're contradicting what you just said. That may be so now, and you can look at it and say there's this choice. I remember Philip saying to me, I know what deconstruction is about. It's a diagonal line.
Yeah.
And that was his definition. And I think the choices that you're talking about aren't categorical options when they're made initially. That's why I was talking about something which is fragile and it's an initiative, and it actually isn't known quite what it'll be and how it'll be done, and the fact that you could make it round instead of square, or a right angle instead of an oblique angle, or something like that.
Right.
And at a certain point, I think what you're saying is, you're assuming it's all been learned.
No,
It's all been learned and it's all understood, and in fact, one guy will do this and another guy will do this, and those are just choices. And I think
Well, I think they're one guy will play acoustic guitar, another guy will play electric guitar, and they will divide an audience. And both of them will have the same record label. So that at a certain level, there'll be a constituency, a politics, and an economics at one level. At another level, there'll be.
But I think I'm looking at it a little bit differently. There must have been a point where one is the exception and one is the rule.
Yes.
And that's an interesting point.
Well, I wanted to.
And then there's another time when what was the exception is no longer an exception, it is just another rule system. At which point you're saying, here's a body of work, and all you have to do is take the oblique angles and make them right angles, and you're back to the same operational use. It just looks different. And the existing Miriansky, when we did it the second time, it was worse. It was actually symmetrical on the inside for reasons that the acoustic argument seemed to validate. But what you're saying is troubling in a sense, that to make it operationally intelligible, regardless of the dancing spatial discussion, that operationally it did what it needed to do, actually, to deliver 4 operas standing simultaneously, which, as far as I know, no theater in the world could do, and this came from Valeri. So there's an enormous production piece, essentially a big block behind all of this. But I think what you're saying is a little bit like the discussion of just make it all right angles. Operationally, it's the same. I mean, there are arguments that I think I would make about moving around in that space, how you understand. You go up and you see one thing, you traverse the perimeter, you understand something else, you cruise through on a bridge. All of these things, there were different vantage points, or ways of looking and seeing and feeling and associating with a really remarkable, I would tell you, the people are so incredibly talented and inventive. The Kirov people, it's astonishing, and it's a privilege to work with those people. And once you have that feeling, I think the Mexico Library was another one like that, which we lost by a vote.
But we're back to the private domain again, because to achieve this, you're literally infiltrating the broader political process, and you're successful in doing that. And you probably have some singular patron, there's some singular voice that's in agreement to allow its realization. But again, the broader political, it's taking us in a different direction. I think the political takes us in, a completely different conversation. Funny, I just came from a meeting from the UCLA Now guys, and we were working with abandoned cities last year, and it's turned into a conversation about abandonment. And it seems that the political takes us into abandonment as an idea, and we're now kind of looking at a broader idea of abandonment. And again, the discussion being within the political discourse as architects, urban designers, it seems like it moves us in very different directions. And then as we talked about abandonment, it became just really interesting. It's its philosophical and religious dominion in Genesis. Very aggressive word. Very, very aggressive word. It has to do with a nostalgia in this country for a frontier, which is still active and alive, of course, on and on. And we're trying, it has to do with an immensely bountiful place. It was ridiculous in its resources, and like locusts, they landed at Plymouth Rock and kind of came across, and it took until the 3/4 of the 20th century before they took everything. And you know the names, because they took coal and oil and copper and on, and they're the Rockefellers and the Gettys, and we could rattle them off, as they're the names of all the libraries and universities. And it wasn't intellectual and creative capital, it was just taking stuff, and then they left it. And they thought nothing of leaving it, right? And they left it in the state. Well, now we leave cities. So Flint, which is a city of 100,000, which has the highest crime rate in the United States, which is equal to Guatemala, has 12 police officers, and they don't work on weekends. Who's ever heard of a city in the United States where they take weekends off? It's the highest crime level. And you're going, what the hell's going on, right? And it's
In LA, they
doesn't
take weekdays off.
because and I'm like, aren't these kind of interesting? And if we're not interested in them, what discipline is interested in these problems? Then who will enter this, and who has any kind of, okay, but if you don't even claim the problems aggressively, let's say, then who's going to do that? And it seems as though we're at a period of time where I'd have said the infrastructural urban stuff is much more compelling or much more relevant than the architecture. They're going to be good architects.
But he said
We
an
know that.
interesting,
We've
a
been
really
there.
interesting thing that I don't know if I've heard mentioned, and you kind of nodded agreement, and I just haven't heard it, which is a wistfulness or nostalgia for a kind of mythological America where everything was open and available. I'm not sure it wasn't a fairly sort of nasty game if you had to get in a wagon and go to somewhere, but it's very romantic, but it's very appealing. Actually, I mean, it might be
It's
Mars.
operational.
No, it's great. It's. I'm not sure. I think I got a feeling when I heard it. I got a feeling it's too bad that's not true, because the opposite is true. It seems like America has shut those aspirations down. I mean, I don't know whether the manifestation is go to Mars or something like that, but the need to keep opening it up. You know, and if you can't open up Oregon or Louisiana, then the space programs and things like that. Or if you go the other way in terms of the sort of Eames old powers of 10, you go out this way or you go in this way, the nano stuff and all that. But the interest in discovery and a kind of continuing mystery of things, that it's mostly enigmatic. It's not mostly we've solved everything. It's mostly we haven't. And the wonder of things, I think a lot of that, at least for the moment, I mean, you look at a big building and another big building and an even bigger building. You look at a plane, a bigger plane, and a bigger plane. You know, a bridge, a longer bridge, a still longer bridge. And at some point, in those things, when a child looks at those things and is amazed and fascinated, and I think the point that's something that ought to belong to everyone, and if it could belong to a culture or a country, it could do amazing things. Because you could look at that in terms of dance or music or architecture. In other words, what's the next wonder? Surprise us. Discover something. It's like Columbus. You know, and I mean, I've said.
But it's moved to constraints, not to wonders. I mean, it's moved to understanding the reality of the world within biological, mineral terms. I mean,
But they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
no, of course not. You find new problems.
Biological mineral terms.
Never find their one.
Now my mic is broken.
Yours too. They're all just going out one by
Anyway,
one.
don't worry.
That leaves me, baby.
I don't need a mic. I want to go to the last part of the discussion because I want to point out just some realities that are occurring in the discipline. You probably couldn't do Diamond Ranch today. With the Good Schools movement and the strength of the lobby for taking the school from architects is where it is today. You probably couldn't do it.
You're right.
Despite how long you spent researching it.
Right.
And I think that speaks a little bit, because I think Diamond Ranch is an incredibly important achievement for me in the discipline and as a member of an audience. And I also think Aldo Ross's argument about why it's so important that schools be places of difference architecturally. You know, it's a little bit like baseball stadiums be different, you know, like everybody figured out when we had the baseball stadium, the game sucked, and now we, you know. So I'm curious how that aligns with your argument. That seems to say just the opposite of your argument.
It's
Because
what you're saying, it's a somewhat more difficult, a more complicated political milieu, there's no question, which requires even...
How did actually Diamond Ranch happen? How did it happen?
It was,
Did you have the patron that you were mentioning? That
it happened to be a graduate of the school. Michael Falonis was on the jury.
So there was one person
They went to a design excellence program, which was started in Los Angeles, came in from the federal government, blah, blah, blah. There was an interest in architecture, and it happened to be an unusual superintendent of schools who was an amazing character. But you're right, it couldn't happen today because the whole milieu has changed, the political environment's changed. It's much, much more difficult. That's what I was saying earlier, that in the globalized, it's a much, much tougher environment. I mean, there's no... You could ask any architect in the world, and they were going to tell you that, right? I mean, John, here's the guy, that project architect, right in front of me with Diamond Ranch. And I don't know, John, it would be a tough one today to do that again, right? You'd agree, right? You've done school since then. By the way, this school wouldn't have started in 1972. There's no hope in hell that this would have happened, even in 1982. Not a chance, right? It'd be impossible. It was a very kind of unique time. Right? It was the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, or the 60s, whatever.
You mean,
and it was an
institutionally
opportunity.
you could
There were
try-
time for huge optimism and opportunities where there was still a collective consciousness that was more embedded in opportunity and an optimism. And today we're in exactly the opposite place. We're in a period of doubt, and out of doubt comes all kinds of kind of really tough, really hate and fear and on that comes out of this condition we're in. It's evident as one looks at this country.
Well, before I use that to introduce, there are three, I think, areas of research in buildings that all of which contribute to a better built environment. And all three contest for the education of architects. One is human sciences. The other one is professional traditions and professional, making essentially the customary and the habitual done better and cheaper. And the other one is what we do, it's a sort of disciplinary discourse. And I think history shows us that the disciplinary discourse is better able to absorb the insights of the human sciences and the achievements of professionalism that either of those two are for understanding the kinds of things that we should do. But that raises the following question. There is a resurgence today in pre-occupancy and post-occupancy evaluations. Post-occupancy evaluations was where a building makes certain claims or does certain things, and then a professional consultant comes in always exactly 1 year later. Always exactly 1 year later. And I was just at the national conference of them, and I asked the guy who's the championing of this, how come it's often the case that it takes architecture 5 or 10 years to start to actually do its work? How come you never go back 5 or, why don't you do post-occupancy evaluation after 5 years and after 10 years? And if you're going to do cities, after 40 years, like Brasilia. And he said, that's interesting, maybe we'll consider that. But even more interesting to me is architects never do that. Like, for all of your claims about all your buildings, now, why aren't we now going back to Diamond Ranch, it's now 10 years later, and seeing if any of the...
New York Times did that 2 years later.
Who?
New York Times did it.
2 years later.
Yeah.
I'm saying, but there were certain claims that you thought you were making in terms of, the organization of the children and the curriculum, and then there were certain issues about the status of the disciplinary issues that could never really be part of the curriculum discussion, that were fundamental to your design researches at the time. And I think that might be because there's no way to go back and measure that. There's no way to go back, and there's a certain point where we acknowledge Pollock's achievements, but we never were able to measure the radical rejection, the slow accommodation, and now the full digestion of that as part of our cultural ethos.
But we were never even allowed to touch the real program. We just shaped the total configuration.
But you isolate.
We're not even close to being allowed to touch, because at the time I was very involved in education with my own two sons. And we had all kinds of ideas, like the differentiation of spaces, the nature of how one behaves within a certain subject matter, on and on. It wasn't even a conversation.
Yeah, but like,
It was
like what would
absolutely
the
standardized
test
from
be?
the beginning.
What in your mind, in each of yours mind, would be a test 10 years later of the Kirov, or a test 10 years later of the big thing in China, the biggest thing out here?
Well, SCI-Arc is actually, SCI-Arc's an interesting example, because if you believe that SCI-Arc originated at a time of optimism, I'm not so sure that's true. I think the people who started the school wanted to assign the making of the school to a movement that William Sloane Coffin, people like that, who were pretty articulate characters from Wisconsin or Harvard or Berkeley or Yale. And I never thought SCI-Arc was about that. I thought that was a little bit disingenuous to associate SCI-Arc with that. Not only that, that movement, whatever it was, had huge adversaries. I mean, you could argue that that movement, in a broader sense in California, changed the whole history of America in the worst possible way, because it elected Reagan as governor, and after he became governor, he moved from governor to president. So it was a minority if it was optimism. And
I would do anything to get Reagan back.
Yeah, well, that's a different that's a different discussion, and a kind of fascinating discussion in a cartoonish
Yeah, exactly.
sort of way. What I'm saying is that period of time, which was for sure an unusual time, and in music, and Hendrix and Joplin and all of that, political characters, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, Dylan, all of those people. Who are still in a way peddling in some cases the same. I mean, Miller listens to Dylan. I mean, but the meanings are very different. In which case, you would be hard pressed to explain, I think, the resurrection of SCI-Arc, because SCI-Arc was when we started was virtually, certainly in abeyance, asymptotic to hasta la vista. And,
Well, I think that,
and
I don't
I
think that's hard to
think,
explain, actually.
I think there is an enormous amount of optimism and energy in the place, and a kind of the same spirit that you guys were talking about, which is what can we open up, America? It's very romantic, actually. I think that's one of its tenets, and as long as it can sustain that, I think it's a strong place. And you have to set it up in a way so that the people who are there are ready to kill each other in a certain sense. And I don't necessarily mean that literally, but they hold certain things very dear, and they're interested in the discourse, and they're interested in the debate, and they're interested in pushing various points of view. And if you can keep it a little bit congenial, I think you have something that you could probably try to bottle, but you can't.
I tell you, you want to know the history of SCI-Arc? Anybody want to know the
I
history
thought
of
you
SCI-Arc?
wanted to know.
I know the history of SCI-Arc because, and here it is. History of SCI-Arc is very simple. You watch Ken Burns' Prohibition, and that's the history of SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc started as a kind of drunken indulgence in too much adequacy of the self. It then went through a very legitimate prohibition period, I think, under Neil, where they tried to put some ideals in and actually do some real good and care about stuff. And then a sense of that being oppressive, and the impossibility of absolutely coping in an environment which had been so cultured in an exploration of the adequacy itself as both a political and personal institution, is what you brought back. And I actually think it's as simple as that. You just watch Prohibition, and that's why I come out here. Like, I'm on the East Coast most of the time where you can't really drink, and I come out here and I have a binge every week. I want to open it up a little bit. Because it is incredible. I mean, this is the most insane school. But the great thing about Prohibition, I hope y'all are watching this.
But wait a minute. Whether that your anecdote fits or not, you don't explain why it's so, how it happened, or if in fact the time is so different, the work is so different.
I think it was the leadership, strictly the leadership. It was Michael, And Michael was basically a laissez-faire, you know, anybody can drink as much as they want. That went too far. I think Neil and Michael, the other Michael, came in and really tried to install a women's temperance unit, like we will make you a better architect by teaching you scenario design and, you know, the Dutchification. And, you know, this is not a school that was looking for a colonial fleet, and that's what they were trying to produce. Although it introduced an incredible amount of intelligence to the school, I think. And then when you came in, it's strictly a question of leadership. I mean, it's why I really believe architects should never practice democracy. They should defend it, but never practice it. Our job is to defend democracy, never to practice it. Leadership is, we are, I think, best when we are confident in our top-down skills, like you are, I think. But I do want to open it up to you guys, if there's any questions.
Kenny, when we're talking about your evaluation, I'm working on that. It's a really, really complicated conversation.
This one?
Because, the notion of coming back and evaluating the post-architects.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And that, because there's no clear criterion, and there's,
That's right.
the
You would
the
never ask the
argument
composer
immediately
that.
gets complicated between the formal representation of the building and, in fact, its other more functional
That's because it's
requirements.
neither of human
And unlike,
science.
and none of us ask anybody what they want, because that's not what I'm interested in.
I know.
Steve Jobs, when asked about marketing, looked at it and thought it was the most ridiculous thing. Why would I want to market? I mean, I know exactly what I want to do. But when you evaluate this, it's a little different. The look of it, it's kind of simple and clean, right? It has a very particular modernist kind of idea. That's completely secondary, right? Its actual operational system in terms of its anthropomorphic, how it operates with your hand, et cetera, and how it changed social behavior. Because he's the second Gutenberg. I mean, he absolutely shifted the nature of how we behave socially. And
It's amazing you think.
Right, and architecture, we don't have the simplicity of this tool in terms of its evaluation process.
That's true.
It's a much more
That's
complicated
right. That's absolutely
process.
true. And it's why you would never ask a composer, do you go back and listen to your early music and say, you know, did it do what you thought it would do? The way they listen to their early music is to do the next piece. The way a painter, and that's what I think an architect does, no matter what. That's what I think you do. You do the next piece because you have a disciplinary problem on your mind and you want to see what's going to happen. I distinctly remember you saying, I'm through with the with the false ground problem. I've completed my work on extending the ground into the building tectonically. And because you knew all of its possibilities at that point, it wasn't that, you know, and so now you need to find where else you needed to go in the work. And so there will be no such thing as you going back and asking the questions of your building because you never formulated them. So that seems to me an invaluable piece of information to have on the table in the public in the school of architecture. Because nobody has ever done that. Not Korb, not Mies, not Rem, nobody. Eisenman is the only one that ever does it because basically his conjecture is, it's so ridiculous, I love to go back and see how ridiculous it is. That's it. Any questions? Yes. Your name, please? I'm so drunk I can't.
I want to comment on something you said on the difference between Rem and Danny.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was an interesting thing. I don't know if you ever heard, I remember hearing this thing in Argentina that people say, like, Corbusier, they would say, like, I like this architecture, but I didn't like the politics. And I would always, you know, people say, like, you know, what they are to like, you know, if you don't like the politics, no, the politics of the architecture of Corbusier. And I'm thinking, you know, to compare back the Danny and Rem case, no? Isn't there like, you know, an act, let's say, on Rem's side that where you're actually, or let's say, Danny's side where like people dislike so much, not so much the architecture, which I would argue hasn't changed so much, you know, since he started, but the politics of it, you know, so politics is not something outside of architecture, but it's the politics of architecture, which is what a lot of people respect of Rem, you know, whether he's an asshole or not, you know.
No, that's true. They love to hear what Rem says, you know, and the politics. You know, when you say the politics of Korb, I'm asking myself, do you mean the implied politics of the architecture, or do you mean the servants' quarters in Villa Savoye, or do you mean the letter to Mussolini and Hitler?
No, I mean, the politics of
Yeah, I mean, so, but I mean, that's what I mean. It's a complicated question, and Frank Gehry's never had a client that wasn't a Republican.
And despite the fact that he's never done anything but support the most ridiculously radical, I mean, he got Jerry Brown elected governor again. So I find these almost irreconcilable tensions really interesting. But I feel like what you're asking me is to know the work, and that's the personal thing is, I think a version of what I'm saying is you will never know your work, and you will never know that work. And as time changes, as Rem does his work, we go back and look at Mises' work completely differently. So Mises' work today is utterly different, not because it's not as good or different or somehow than Rem. Rem teaches us to see potentialities in Corb and Mises that no one ever saw before. So the role of contemporary work is not only to open up new possibilities and to give an instantiation to inchoately formed existential feelings, but also to completely reinvent the past as the present. So I think you couldn't get a more complex model than that, and it doesn't sound as science fairy as you do. I don't mean fairy, science fair-ish. But I think the other thing about artists, and I sit here every time I'm always amazed that I'm on this panel. Like, how can I be sitting between these two guys in front of this audience? It's like
This is your panel.
I'm just
That's
thinking.
why you're on it.
No, but I'm sitting here thinking, when is somebody going to catch me? When are they going to find out? I have no business here. I don't have any idea what I'm talking about, and this is like some kind of scam. And then. And then I always remember that scene.
Everybody knows that.
I know. In Fiddler on the Roof, where the rabbis are arguing, I say this all the time. One rabbi says something, and Tevye says, "You're right." And the other rabbi says something exactly the opposite, and Tevye says, "You're right." And then the third guy says, Tevye, they can't both be right. And he says, "You're right." And, I think that's how I've got here. Anyway, so it's incredibly moving for me, and I hope it is for you. Yes, question? There are skip stops in the San Francisco. But, I think your question is more interesting in what it reveals than in what it asks. Because you must have an exotic interest in skip stops, since you're the first person on the history of the planet I've ever actually heard ask about that in political terms other than just expediency of cheap elevators and saving energy. But why is that? Why are you interested in the skip stops? Yes. Okay, but here's the problem with that. If you say grids, you see grids in totalitarian governments, and you see grids in, that kind of argument. I think that's such bullshit. It's pointless, because there's the grid of Savannah is 1/9 the scale of the grid of Seattle. So if you generically say something like skip stop or grid or right angle, and you're not paying close attention to the specific material effects of each one and its scale and context, then you really are talking about something so abstract as to not, like a skip stop in any sense will not belong to a political discipline.
No, but there was an answer to that question. The answer should have been, it's a social model. Right?
No, but I think that's what
it's Ginsburg, it's Corbusier looking at Ginsburg to start with. Assert at the time at the end of the CIM, and you look at Peabody Terrace and Harvard, it's a social model, right?
I know, but it's a social model that seems so naive today.
maybe a yes. and
That only
no.
people, that, you know, in fact, I remember you arguing about the skip stop for, not for.
It's just a given, and I don't even take it as a serious thing. It's just, it's there to be taken, not taken.
And that's what I'm saying, is if you make naive one-to-one correlations between this particular architectural device and this particular political effect, you're dead. You want, it's like, I don't think you can do that. You can't say a minor chord is always going to be sad and a major chord is always going to be happy, even though a lot of stuff that's sad is minor and a lot of stuff that's happy is major. I mean, that's the kind of mistake, that's called the affect encyclopedia approach. In this, you know, in the 17th century, they actually tried to do that, and we know better than that. You know, I think, and the other thing is, you know, if I ask you what does the word draw mean? You got an answer. Okay. He said it's an act of putting an idea on paper. You mean like drawing a sketch, right? How about like drawing a conclusion? Does it mean the same thing? How about drawing to a conclusion? So I can change the meaning of the word draw right in front of your face by just sticking other words around it. I think, I mean, this is probably where I would align with Eric. I think what you want is a model of behavior that's reliable and a model of meaning that's has a longevity that we don't really discover in architecture. And I never see it. I see increasing indifference or inurement, and I see people get irritated about having to walk up half a step.
What's interesting about this conversation, it started as a social model. It's a 90-year-old idea. Nothing invented, right? And for myself, the use of this off-the-shelf idea allowed for differentiation in public space. Simple as that. So I have a generic building, the San Francisco building, and it allows me to produce differentiated space, which is public space. Cooper, much more so. It allows me to develop the major element in a very simple, generic building, and it allows me to develop that public space, which is now an invention, the vertical space, right? So it's a means to an end, right?
Well,
And it's nothing but that. You're just taking something off the shelf.
You're talking about a tactical means. I mean, if you, to give a completely different example and to displace it in time, if you walk through the Vatican Museum and you see any number of painters, contemporaneous painters, I don't mean in our time, but in the 15th century time, and is it Botticelli and Raphael, with a modus operandi which is pretty consistent, like a skip-stop building. And they're all the same. They're all the same. Subject matter consistent, tactics consistent, perspective means consistent, and they're very, very different. And I think that's the part we're interested in. So you can stipulate the pieces that make them consistent. And now we have to see where the differentiation occurs.
Actually, Hernan and I are going to do a session together, and he's going to show, it's a session about influence. And he's going to discuss about his relationship to Peter and to Marias. And we're going to discuss how originality comes out of influence. And the reason I'm raising this is, if you listen to the first three ballets of Stravinsky, which are Firebird, Petrushka, and then Rite of Spring, Ballet 1 and 2, which are very good, very widely regarded, have enormous passages in them that are directly quoted out of his teacher's work, which is Rimsky-Korsakov. And by the time you get to the third one, you can still hear Rimsky-Korsakov, but it's because he's worked through those passages, and he's done exactly what Eric said. He's taken a trope and found a new context to bring the trope back alive, and as far as I'm concerned, that's not only why the piece is original.
That makes all the difference.
That's what I think.
is the point.
That is your job.
The answer to the question is the opposite of the question, which is how is it always the same and what makes it different? Because you're saying it starts at Ginsberg and it goes to Le Corbusier and it winds up in Peabody to whatever the chronology is, and it's all the same. And it's not. And the difference is really what we're looking at.
Yes.
And in the difference, you make something which in fact is not anticipatable simply as a consequence of the generic pro forma. It's different. It's a different meaning.
And that's why the
It's
human...
a different meaning, and it makes you look at the pieces that in a generic sense are part of the categorical imperative, and they're different now.
Okay, go ahead.
Original, of origin.
Yeah.
The concept.
Well, there are concrete effects, and there are predictable concrete effects. But, you know, walking up a staircase is an important, predictable, concrete effect in architecture. And you see it in courthouses, and you see it in churches, and you see it in a lot of stuff. And you know, so it's not a scientific effect. It's a little bit like a font in a book. If you open a book and you read it, you can't see the font. If you look at the font, you can't read the book, but the whole time you're reading the book, the font is doing work. But it's not scientific work, and it's not professional work.
Until E.E. Cummings came along and
That's right.
changed the font.
Or if you look at House of Leaves, I know all of you are suffering the presence of Todd Gannon here, so all of you have been forced to buy a copy of this god-awful, impossible-to-read book, just to sustain his sense that it's so good. But if you open the front page of it, it's typeset as if it's manuscript type. And what's incredible about that is, of course, as you start to read it, that goes away, but it never quite goes away as much as just a simple Times Roman. It's interesting, and that's actually what we're talking about. So I don't really think it's just anybody can name anything and therefore claim and appropriate the effect to a narrative. There's not an infinite number of narratives capable of taking care of any body of effects, but I do think it's vague in the sense that you're talking about is no one can sufficiently specify the choreography of the effects to take sufficient control over them to turn them into a science. So, and that's why there's teaching. That's why you learn the tricks and you learn how to make fun of it. Like if you watch Penn and Teller, I don't know if you saw this, when they cut a woman in half but instead of a saw, they use a NMR, you know, right? So they cut her in half, but not by physically cutting her in half. When they took the picture of her with the NMR, you know what an NMR is? You know, they stuck her in that cave and they took her picture out of her and she came out divided. I don't know how he did it, but anyway, he had to be there. Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah. Now what I'm saying is you're now looking at the font. It's not going to work until you're not looking at the font, and then it's going to have a set of effects that are more reliable than you give them credit for, and less arbitrary than you fear they might be. But what they won't do, it's just like cross-programming. It's not really true that if you put two programs in the same space at the same time, they'll interfere with each other and you get spontaneous social reactions. What you get is a lot of irritated people. You know, I mean, if you've ever been to a library where there's a running track in it, it's not, you know, I never have spontaneously fallen in love with a runner in a library. I've just said, shut the fuck up and, you know, quit running around or something like that. So that's what I'm saying is you have to allow, like, or another example is something like the soundtrack in a movie. If you watch the film Psycho, we've seen Psycho. If you watch it without the soundtrack, you won't feel any fear at all. If you listen to the soundtrack itself, you will feel a different kind of fear than if you put the two together. But the soundtrack won't work if you sit there and watch the film and pay attention to the soundtrack. So there's a whole way that architecture occupies spectrums of attention with its body of effects that it's more like magic, I think, than it is like science. But
hey, you're actually, I mean, you're answering a question that he's not, he's asking a much simpler question.
yeah, can I
And,
just
well, it's the old Vincent Scully, if one guy at a time walks up the hill of the Acropolis and they're doing this, it's a democracy. And if you're at Nuremberg and you line up like
Yeah,
the
it's
Russians.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
I
That's
mean,
what he's asking.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That level of one-to-one instrumentality of any architectural effect not only cannot be produced, it can never be desirable if it is produced. So you have to change schools immediately and go to Princeton, where we swear to God that you can do that.
I once heard a definition of politics as getting what you want and making for the person who makes it for idea. Do you think that the way Thom was talking about how, or the way you were talking about how Diaz can accomplish is what he's trying to accomplish, the way that disciplinary goals are enacted in a
Yeah, I think, yes. By the way, I think it's also how political goals are enacted. I'm starting to think that there's nothing but art.
But I remember the previous lecture you were talking about how in music now there's more
Yes,
political dimension.
that's right.
Because there's so much of it.
Because it has actually fulfilled its political ambition and become fully democratized, yes. And that's an interesting, I mean,
Because of the idea that kind of politics as being something that builds consensus, as opposed to, which might talk about the idea that we're coalescing on entities, which seems no longer possible.
I was listening,
More the cunning of the architect to sort of bring certain disciplinary goals into society.
yeah, I mean, Alfred Hitchcock, you have to watch this movie called Double Take, but Alfred Hitchcock said the best thing for democracy is to have an enemy. You know, then you get together, suppress your trivial differences, and work democratically to, you know, but as soon as you don't have an enemy, then, and let me change it this way, it's odd to me that there has never been a society in the history of mankind that I know of in which money and power has not inevitably produced infantilization in its population. You know, where if you have enough money and you have enough power, meaning you can do what you want, exactly what you said, then your desire for your goals become incredibly infantile, and which is where I think we are now. And I think that's what you're talking about. So we're not talking about e pluribus unum anymore. We're talking about e pluribus pluribissibus, you know, where, and it would be really interesting if we could imagine a society where the increase in wealth and power and instrumental ability caused us to behave with greater maturity and deferred gratification, you know. And actually, it's one of the things I think architecture, because just simply because how long it takes to build and think about and stuff like that, seems like it has a potential. Like one could formulate a speculative discourse, a projective discourse about architecture in those terms. And like I said, but you will never be able to produce it any more than a grid has ever produced a democracy.
Right, with part of that, with the global shift, there's also the intensification of capital, the condensation, where the 1% is now 20, which is 1928. Right?
Wait, the 1% of what is now 20?
1%, the 1% of the richest 1% are equal to 20%.
Right.
The richest 10 are worth 90%. 90, right? And it's an unusual time in history. Literally, it's 1928 was an equal.
Is that right?
Yeah.
668
A little higher,
families.
like 21% in 1928.
668 families. You saw this thing in the British Economic Magazine. 668 families control 95% of the world's wealth. Don't you like that? I like that. One of mine, I'm in one of those families. It's called the Rothschild International Jewish Conspiracy family. We sold all our newspapers to the Mormons, and now we. Go ahead. You have a question?
Actually, the question is more related to those internal disciplinary conversation more than the public face of the problem. One, it has to do with the relation of politics and media in the way that I think, part for me, my question will be to you if you agree or disagree with this. Part of the problem to me in relation to architecture and politics and why it's not so much part of the agenda in most of the disciplinary discussions regarding institutionalization and others is, one, I think we still will operating on the model of meaning and symbolic value of architecture that doesn't belong to the contemporary culture anymore, but belongs to a model of 100 years ago, which architecture was much more directly linked to the political expression. But the second question in relation to that, there was a time also that a radical progressive architecture agenda was parallel to the radical progressive political agenda, which doesn't seem to be the case anymore, meaning that in this contemporary time, most of the right-wing politics produce left-wing architecture, and most of the left-wing politics produce right-wing architecture.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just want your take on that, if we need to reshape and update the mediums in political relation to it and stop using
Niemeyer in
early 20th
right.
century model of, that's one. And the second one, and I think Wolf in his recent lecture, he mentioned about that, like most of like a regime like China has produced some of the most interesting radical architecture in the last time. How we deal with that, how we cope with that, and how we make that part of disciplinary discussion and doesn't become just a matter of professional experience to get to visions.
Meaning and symbolism.
The China question is actually an interesting one. It's such a huge example because the question is that really radical architecture anymore? Because if you're associating, in the first place, that divergence goes back a long way. It goes back to the 20s. So Le Corbusier comes along and makes the mundaneum. And this guy, Carl Teague, who wrote that famous critique of Le Corbusier as a formalist, and that he had abandoned the sort of Hannes Meyer way of function and economics and so on. So it's not a new discussion. And I'm not sure, but this is maybe not so different than the Nuremberg versus the Hill of the Acropolis discussion, whether it's possible to associate a political and social motive with an architectural form language at all. In other words, whether that's a plausible argument to make. And that you can look at what was done under Stalin in the early years, and then the Palace of the Soviets is an interesting example. That's supposed to be a radical administration. It's a conservative administration. Most of the administrations, whether it's Mao, whether it's Fidel, whether it's Stalin, all of these that nominally represented a social progressive model of politics actually produced architecture that was more in line with the Gulag architecture, except very early in Russia when the situation was a little more happenstance. I tend to look for the odd guys. There's a guy we had so much trouble in Russia, I wouldn't trade it. It was fascinating. But there's this guy Khodorovsky, the guy do you know who that guy is? This is one of the oligarchs who owned the oil and owned he owned everything, and all of a sudden he owned nothing, and he was back in prison. And it turns out, I think New York Times ran a piece recently on him. He's a writer, and somehow he's allowed to write and to speculate on all of this. And the question is, over a long period of time, what's durable and what's ultimately meaningful, and what is indicative of the content of that regime at that time? Is it what Putin said or Putin did, who controls almost everything, or is it what Khodorovsky said, or Solzhenitsyn would be another example? If you had Brezhnev, a Kosygin, a Stalin, or whatever, and then you have this guy who turned out to be a horrible reactionary, by the way, which is also an odd story. It's hard to chase these things down to any thematic conclusion. And I think for me, it's impossible to associate a political predilection with an architectural form language, although the aspiration to that takes place everywhere, in the service of Prada, in the service of Hu Jintao and everybody else. I mean,
until you see something like the new, you say that about speculative work, but if someone were to come in and do neoclassical work or to build the new embassy in London, there is a kind of work where we are so maybe oversensitive to the fact that it's installing a kind of
regime through meaning, even if it's cliched meaning.
Well, maybe the argument just has to be made one building at a time.
But you start with Wolf, and I can tell you, there is absolutely no connection between the work and any cultural, political agenda whatsoever. None.
What?
Zero. None.
Wolf, you
And
say
I
that
mean,
you think
no,
that to be?
I'm thinking of the Project Medallion that you was talking about. We just had a conversation about it. I've been on 3 juries which awarded Rem Koolhaas, huge project, and St. John, an enormous project. Stephen Hall, twice, both huge projects. Nobody had any idea. It was based on engendered effects, on
Yeah, that's
broad, iconographic kind of sense of the thing, and it was just completely, totally abstract. I'm leaving tomorrow morning for China to start another building, same thing. As we started building, there's absolutely no connection whatsoever. It's a free form.
Politicking and politics, I was talking more about exploration and society.
I know, but-
Use of literature as an expression of that.
But what I would say is either, I would disagree with you in the following sense. I think the goal of the discourse of effects was to put aside the discourse of meaning and symbolism, and to change it to a different level of attention, to broaden the idea of a spectrum of attention. Now, we may not have been as well, here's the problem. When you are inside, when you're designing a font, you're going to be thinking, you're going to be thinking in close attention terms because you're doing the design with an eye to what happens as an effect when the change in spectrum of attention. So whenever we're discussing something or, internal discussions, we're always paying the same kind of attention to the work, even if the goal of the work is to engender a different kind of attention. So, okay, well, that was fun being out. Oh, one more question? Yeah. That was 2 weeks ago. I don't believe that anymore. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. Come on, what was the question? Mm-hmm.
How is it that building operates further, as opposed to that sort of erratic out of the
Well, it operates operatically, and like, for example, when you go down the stairs and you're in the crypt, if you are sensitive to how you've gotten there and where you are, then the crypt thing works. And it says something about, for the audience that is sensitive to it, about what the future of art is in Berlin. By the time you get to the Wexner Center, Eisman has figured out how you go down a staircase, which I'll show you later, and not have that happen. And so that becomes a really interesting possibility. Well, look. No, first of all, fortunately, you're never going to do one thing the rest of your life without an intention, despite all your efforts to try, even Wolf's efforts to do automatic writing or anything. You're going to make you're going to make a decision to act in a certain way, and that decision to act is going to have very little to do with the full consequences of your actions. That's true with every decision you make. That doesn't mean you're either not connected at all to the results, but it does mean you're not in control of the results. And I think, in some sense, that was the tension a little bit today between Eric and Thom. Eric wants to indulge in some sense of not being in control, and Thom feels like he's driven, both for the reasons of his own work and the context of the world, to try to be in as much control as he possibly can be, knowing full well he'll never achieve that. But you don't have to worry about, it's a youthful thing to drive yourself crazy by falling into the mise en abyme of, why bother to do anything if either what I mean to do won't happen or, it won't work. Don't worry about that. That help? Or come meet me privately. Okay. So it was really fun being out here. I'll see you guys.